So now I'm going to set up the ReadQuery class. It's going to go into database helpers because it interacts directly with the database. It's a new class. I'm going to call it ReadQuery. And just inside the public class, I'm going to declare a couple of private variables there that I'll use across multiple methods. And I notice I'm getting some errors here, and I'll come back and clean these up in a minute. Inside of this ReadQuery class, I need to set my ReadQuery method. And inside the ReadQuery method, this is what I'm going to use to actually make the connection to the database. So I've got, again, some errors I'll clean up, but I want to show you my logic. So I'm declaring a new properties as props. I'm declaring a new input stream as inStream. And essentially, this just lets me read in the contents of a file. And the file's contents that I want to read are dbcon.properties. I want to get that URL, username, and password. Then the next thing I'm going to do here is load that input stream and load those into the properties. And then after I've loaded them and read down through that file, then I'm going to close that file. Now that I have that information from that file stored in the properties, I can go get it. So I'm declaring some new variables. Driver is going to be equal to get the property. Driver.name was one of the listings in that database connections property. Server.name, user.name, user.password. Those could have been anything I wanted. Those are names that I chose. And then those were populated with the actual details for the driver name, the server name, the username, those kinds of things. Class.forName driver, this is how we load the driver. And so this is actually loading up that OJDBC6 jar file. It's loading it here. It knows to load that file because I'm telling it to get it out of the property's name. So database connection property has driver name that points to this OJDB6. This variable is getting that value and putting it in that variable, and then here it's using that variable. And then the last thing we're doing is creating a connection using the driver manager. It's getting the URL, username, and password. And again, those are the variables that are populated with the information coming out of this dbcon properties. All right, so let's set about cleaning up our errors now. Some of them are simple. We just need to import some of them are more complex. These can throw errors, so we have to have a way to catch those. And when I have no red squiggly lines, then I'm good to go. Everything looks good. So this ReadQuery method is just simply loading the database connection properties, reading in all those variables that I declared in there, putting them in new variables here, and then using them to make a connection to the database. So at the end of ReadQuery, I have a connection to the database. So now that I have a connection to the database, I need to execute some SQL. I'm going to create a new method for that called doRead. And doRead has a variable, string variable called query that has the SQL I want to run. So select star from the friends table. I'm going to use a prepared statement, and a prepared statement lets us force this information into the query. It's to help prevent SQL injection attacks and things like that. And then I want to populate the results that I've declared up here with the results that come back after I execute that query. And I've got a couple of issues here. And again, those things could generate errors, so I need to create error handling to try and catch all those. I need to create one other method called getHTMLTable, or that's what I'm going to call it. So public, it's going to return as a string. getHTMLTable. And inside of this method, I'm going to take all of those results that are coming back from doRead, and I'm going to format them into an HTML table that then I can stick where I would like it in my JSP. So to get started, I'm going to declare the variable table as a string data type, and I'm going to set it empty. Then I'm going to add to that table, plus equals, the opening HTML tag table. This is an HTML5, but I'm going to use it just in this example. Border equals 1. I could set that to ID equals or class equals or whatever if I was using CSS. And then the other thing I want to do is close up the table. And then finally, I want to return the table. So again, if I'm looking at this, I've just declared an empty variable named table, and then I appended to that the opening HTML table tag. I'm going to do some work here in the middle, but to close it up, I'm going to close up the HTML table tag, and then I'm going to return the table. So now I want to get here in the middle of the table. And I'm going to need to loop in here so that for every record, I can add a row. So I'm going to use a while loop to retrieve all of the records coming back out of the database. So while this dot results dot next. So results are getting populated here from my doRead. So as it moves through those results, as long as there's a next record, that's the pointer. As long as there is a next record, it is going to grab the information and put it in our model. So I need to establish our model. Our model is friends. I need a new instance of that. So I created an object from our class. So this object, I'm going to set the friend ID Remember getters and setters? I'm setting it equal to get int friend ID. So int because it's a number, and friend ID because that's the field in the database that I'm looking for. So I'll need to use my setters that I need to get the rest of the information out of the database and into my model for this single record or this single object. So I've got it set up now. Every time there is a result or a new row from the database, I'm going to take the friends class and make an object of it. That object, I'm going to set the friend ID for that one particular object equal to the actual information coming out of the database: friend ID, friend name, email address, age, and color. I'm going to pay attention to whether it should be a string or an integer. And I'm going to do that as long as there's a next record. When there's not a next record, I'll stop adding. The other thing I need to do here is import my friends class. So now I have that information in there for a particular object. Now I want to dump that out into an HTML table that I can use. So within the loop, I'm going to create the table row. Every record in the database will be a row in my HTML table. So I'm going to open and close the row. And then within every row, I'll have multiple columns. Table data. So I open and close the table data. And then within that table data, I will have the information coming out of my model. So the object, and now I'm going to get. And I forgot some semicolons here. Get everything cleaned up. So now essentially it will create the table row, and then inside of that table row it will have a table data, and it will put the friend ID. In that same row or in that same record from the database, I want it to capture other information. Friend ID, friend name, friend email address, and again I'm using get instead of set, age, and finally their favorite color. Okay, so these are all the columns of data I have for a single row. So inside of this loop, as long as there is a next in the results, it will create a new object of my friends class. It'll set the properties of that object using the setters, and it will set those properties as integers or strings based on the data type from the database fields. It will create a new row for every object, or every row in the database will be a new row in my HTML table, and it will be the friend ID, the friend name, the address, the age, and their favorite color. Finally, we'll close up the table row, and then it would move to the second loop. And on the second loop, it would create a second object from the friends class, and it would populate it with whatever that second row of data is. I have 4 records in my database, so I would have 4 of these, 4 loops. Finally, when it's done looping, it will append to the close table command at the end, and then it will just return that table as a string. So a lot going on inside of there. And here I have several errors I'm going to try to clean up. So that loop could generate some SQL exception errors, so this is just put the try catch around there. I think that cleans up everything. Looks good. So now the next thing I'm going to do is try to get the ReadServlet going. And the ReadServlet will actually be a controller, and it will be a servlet. So it'll be a new servlet. It will be named read. This is the URL pattern matching. Remember on index.jsp, the URL was a little bit different. It was just going to read instead of an actual page. So to match that, I'm going to change this to a little r. And now whenever we see a little r read, it will know to invoke this read servlet. And a read servlet has two components to it. It has a get and a post. Expressed as do get and do post. And we talked about those a little bit in class. Get is bringing information from the server to the client. Post is pushing information from the client to the server. We can just choose to program in one of those if we want. We're just going to program in the post. So we'll make get, we'll just have get reference do post. So if a get request would show up, we'll just pass it on to a post request. I'll show you how we do that. So in our get request, we're going to get rid of this process request because we're not going to do that. We are just going to simply pass execution on to do post. So we're going to call the method do post, and we're going to pass to do post the request and the response. Any request, any response. So do get, there's no programming in there. It sends it on down to post. So now we're down here inside of the do post method. And inside of the do post method, we basically want to do three things. We want to create the read query helper object. So when this read servlet is invoked, we want the read servlet to invoke the read query and actually make that connection to the database, get the results, and then process those results into an HTML table. All that's happening inside of read query. When the results come back from read query, we want to get the HTML table. And then the last thing we want to do is pass that HTML table and control along to the page that will display that table. In our case, read.jsp. So here we want to make an object, an RQ object of our read query class. We'll have to import the read query class. The next thing we'll do is we'll execute the doRead method of the read query object. So the doRead method passes the SQL, brings them back as a result. When we call the read query, the connection is automatically established. So when we do the doRead is passing the SQL along and returning the results. And then the next thing we're doing is here locally, we're setting up a variable named table. It's a string type variable. And we are doing the getHTML method, getHTML table method of the read query object. So we're processing those results into the HTML table, bringing them back here as a variable, a string variable. Last thing that we're going to do in do post, set the attributes for the table. We're just creating a URL and pointing it to read.jsp. So read.jsp is not where the index.jsp, that URL is not pointing to read.jsp. That URL is just pointing to read, which because of our mapping is this read servlet. This read servlet then points it to read.jsp. Creates a request dispatcher, and this is just how we can move from one file to the other, pass execution from one file to the other. The URL, so it's read.jsp, and then it's just forwarding the request and the response, so it will forward this table to read.jsp. Here I'll have to import it. So the read servlet looks good, the read query looks good. Last thing I need to do is create read.jsp. In read.jsp, I need to get that table variable that's getting passed. So here we declared the variable table. It's populated with the table that we created from the results in read query. So now in read.jsp, I just need to get the attribute for table, or get the table, and bring it over here. and then I just need to echo it back out. Let's see how this all works. Notice down here in the lower left, it's going to read, not read.jsp. It's executing the read servlet. That URL mapping was made when we created the read servlet. The read servlet instantiates a read query, brings the read query, makes the connection, brings the results back, formats the results into a table. Then the read servlet creates that table as a variable, a string variable, that it can pass to read.jsp, which is where we are right now. We're on read.jsp, which is null unless the table is being passed, and shows our information from the database. Unbelievable that as complicated it was, I got it right on the first try, so I'm sure there will be troubleshooting to do.